Welcome to Lost Relation Chronicles.
So that's why she didn't come to the funeral, didn't even acknowledge my letter, Penny thought. She put her forehead to the cold glass in the window overlooking the village street, gazing with a detached vision at the blanket of early December snow, which was covering the street and narrow front garden with a lovely covering of white. But Penny wasn't fooled. She knew the ugliness and neglect that was hidden below the snow. She knew this would be a bleak Christmas for her. Like so many of the others she had gritted her teeth through over the years while others basked in the glow of the season within the bosoms of their families. She let her shoulders sag and loosened her finger hold on the typed letter, letting it flutter to the floor. She had thought that it was because Millie still carried the resentment of their parents, their father an ever-complaining tyrant and their mother a whiny alcoholic. The estrangement had sent Millie spinning out of England to Spain, where she'd been this last decade and more, answering Penny's letters with only terse responses, not answering their father's few, complaining and judgmental letters at all. Not that Penny would have answered the letters from her father to Millie that she'd gotten a glimpse of either, full of bitterness and judgment for Millie having gone off with a foreigner and not, to anyone's knowledge, having ever married him. Penny knew why Millie hadn't married Rodrigo. He already was married, and, being Catholic, there would be no divorce even if there was no love. He'd been older than Millie. Millie had let Penny know when Rodrigo had died, but her father had been so bitter about it that neither one had bothered to tell him. Now this letter, from a hospital in Lugo, Spain, from some sort of patient representative, a sister someone or other. Penny's father buried not more than a week in Penny, who had taken full care of him at his village house during his last 2 months, only now beginning to wrap up his affairs and go back to her job in the bookstore. It was the Christmas season. The bookstore would need all of its employees pulling overtime. They hadn't been kind about holding her job for her while she cared for her father in his last days, certainly not considering how much time and effort she'd given them for over a decade. The bookstore was her total life now, but it didn't seem like she meant that much to the bookstore. The problem was that now the hospital in Spain wanted to send Millie back to her house. There wasn't anything they could do for her. The cancer was too far advanced. She was insisting on going home to die. But there had to be someone there to receive Millie and take care of her. Penny was the only relative of hers that Millie had identified on her admittance forms, and she claimed there was no one in Spain to take care of her. Penny knew, though, that her job wouldn't be held for her to allow her to attend another relative through a terminal illness, certainly not during the Christmas season. With a sigh, Penny reached down and picked the letter up off the floor. Family was family, no matter how estranged. She sank down into the chair at the old secretary, read the address at the top of the letter and the sister's name, and began to write her return letter. Penny hadn't expected to be met by anyone at the airport in Santiago. She'd sent her flight number and arrival time in the letter telling Sister Noela at the Lugo hospital she was coming, but she hadn't received an answer. But there was a younger man, at least young in Penny's mind, as she was a bit past 30 herself, standing in the reception hall, waving a sign with her name on it. How many Penelope Stanleys could there be coming off the same flight in northwestern Spain? Sonora Stanley, he asked rather hesitatingly when she came and stood in front of him and pointed to his sign. She had never thought of herself as tall, but she was a couple of inches taller than he was. Other than that, he seemed normal and was supporting an engaging smile. He was dark-haired and a bit swarthy, but quite presentable. Looking at him now, she could see that he probably was older than she was, maybe even 10 years. If so, the years had treated him well. "Yes, I am Penny Stanley," she answered, trying to give him a smile that equaled his. But she'd just come off a long day catching her flight without knowing where she was going from here other than the address of her sister's house somewhere in the region. Somewhere on a mountain slope above the Mijo River, if she remembered rightly what her sister had once written to her. She had no idea how far it was from the Santiago airport, though. She could tell from the map that there was a good distance between Santiago and Lugo, where the hospital was. "I am Jesus," the man said in halting and heavily accented, but easily understood, English. "Jesus has come to take you to your home. I know you didn't expect anyone from the family to meet you. The hospital didn't know that your sister had family here until it was too late to inform you." Penny was quick to adjust to the man's way of referring to himself by name, although it made her smile each time she heard it. She also was greatly relieved to know that there was someone here with connections to Millie, and that she didn't have to figure out everything for herself. My home? Penny thought. Hardly, although she couldn't say where her home was at the moment. Her own flat in Reading was just a rental, and she'd put her father's house close to Oxford up for sale, and already had offers on that, as housing was tight in the university town. It had also been uplifting to discover that houses, even a modest one like her father had lived in, went for a good price in the Oxford area. If she could find a far cheaper economy to live in, She could squeak by on the interest from what she'd get for the house without having to continue working herself. As she was afraid, the bookstore had let her go, and she didn't have a specific job to go back to. She wasn't that fond of her flat and reading either, so home was something to be negotiated at this point when the time came. It certainly wasn't in a remote area of hot and dusty Spain, though. Did you say Jesus? Is your name really Jesus? She asked, trying, unsuccessfully, to keep the tone of disbelief and challenge out of her voice. That couldn't be right. He just beamed back at her. Yes, we don't spell it as you would, but it's the same name. We use that name in Spain. Spanish Catholics believe in instilling the attributes of the Holy Family in our families. My father's name was Zesis and his father's name was Zesis. So, my name is Zesis. My brother is Joseph and my mother is Maria. So, oh, well, that's interesting, Penny said. And strange, she thought, but she didn't want to start off on the wrong foot with anyone here, especially someone who had met her at the airport to take her to Millie's house. As they drove east from Santiago, she appreciated even more that someone had come to pick her up, as the journey was long and the route convoluted. But she also was surprised to find that her impression of Spain as hot and dusty didn't hold for this Galician region. The hills were rolling and still lush with vegetation. It was been a crazy year in weather across Europe, and winter had not reached northern Spain yet. It was as green as England was in summer, even more green if that was possible, while being wilder and more lush in foliage, and with steeper slopes running down to the faster-flowing waterways. The villages they passed on the way were even smaller and less ordered than those in the reading area and as old, if not older, most being made out of stone, many unoccupied and falling down. But in a picturesque way. She wouldn't have known that Christmas was approaching if many of the houses didn't already have colored lights and a smattering of outdoor Christmas ornaments on display. It was nearly dark when they arrived at a hodgepodge of stone cottages set at angles and closely abutting a small, winding road high above a meandering river, with a checkerboard of garden plots, many planted to grapevines, tumbling down the slope to the water. Nothing was in flower or full leaf now, of course, but it didn't take much to envision how vital this countryside would look in full bloom. Fincas, Zesis explained as he maneuvered along a road, hugging the side of the mountain, and observed Penny looking down at the pattern of small plots. Fincas? Yes. Through the centuries, family holdings of the fields became divided and subdivided in families intermarried to the point that everything is divided into small plots. Fincas, and a family now could have a series of the plots located separately so that they have to do more walking than tending of the plots to cover them all in a day. Sonora de Perez has several of the fincas down there. Sonora de Perez? Yes, your sister. Zesis gave her a quizzical look. Yes, Penny said. So, Millie was going by the name Perez here rather than Stanley. That must have been Rodrigo's surname. They will think the two of them were married here. It's likely they didn't know Rodrigo had a wife elsewhere. That was natural enough, she supposed. If the villagers knew of their living arrangements, they likely would be unwelcoming, and Millie wasn't one to take an effort to make friends herself. Zesis pulled up in front of a stone cottage that looked like a ruin, and that was so close to the road that the small Fiat Zesis was driving barely had room to park between the road and the rock wall. A door opened, and light spilled out onto the Fiat before it was stifled by the figure of a heavy-set, elderly woman. Doors. From the village. She has been sitting with Sonora de Perez, Zesis explained. And so it began. Millie had already been sent home from the hospital to die. Yet another ordeal of vigilance to the end for Penny, her last living relative, and yet another one who she had not been close to in life. She hauled herself out of the Fiat and reached for her suitcase, but Zesis was faster than she was at hefting it. The village woman, Doors, gave her a stiff, "Hola, buenas," and an, "It's about time you got here," look as she stood aside for Penny to enter the cottage. The two women had barely acknowledged each other at the door before Doors had turned to return to the sick room, and Penny's attention had been arrested by seeing a decorated Christmas tree beside a fireplace in which a fire had been laid. She almost cried. She hadn't had time to even think about decorating a tree before she left England. Seeing where her gaze was turned, Zesis gently said, "Christmas trees are important back in England. We thought." Yes, thank you, Zesis. It's lovely." And indeed it was. Already the heaviness that had been weighing her down for what it seemed like years was lifting. "Now, maybe I should see my sister," she said, pulling herself back into reality. Millie had settled down at last, the effects of the morphine finally having taken hold. Penny had held and rocked her just as she'd seen the village woman, Doors, doing while Zesis was showing her around the cottage. There hadn't been much to see inside the house, and it was a work in progress, although the progress part of the work was well done. There was the main room that served as living room, dining room, and kitchen. This room, as well as Millie's, off to the left as the cottage was entered, had been tastefully renovated with some sections of the wall being stone and some white plasterboard. The plasterboard sections were hung with abstract landscapes that obviously were from the village area and were masterfully done. Lights hung over these, the only lighting in the room other than the glowing Christmas tree, to which Penny's eyes frequently wandered in appreciation. Millie's bedroom was large, with a similar wall treatment. A modernized bath and large walk-in closet were on the street side of this wing, and the bedroom opened up onto a stone terrace that ran the full length of the house on the back, with a view down the slope to the Miho River and up the mountainside on the other side of the narrow river valley. The room to which Zesis had taken Penny's suitcase was on the other side of the house. Her bedroom was small, but also opened out onto the terrace and back. The walls were just stone, and the room obviously hadn't been renovated yet. A primitive bath, entered from both sides, separated it from a room, also not renovated, on the front of the house, which obviously was an office and catch-all room. From the art supplies strewn about, it also had once been used as an art studio. The unfinished paintings were by the same hand as those on the walls in the renovated part of the house. Rodrigo? Penny wondered. She couldn't think of Millie as having artistic talent, but she was having difficulty remembering anything about Millie, who was nearly 10 years Penny's senior and had left England and, as she put it, the clutches of her family, when Penny was too young and alienated from the family herself to pay much attention. She didn't know any more about Rodrigo, other than that Millie said, when she left, that she'd follow him to the ends of the earth if she had to. As Penny remembered it, her father's major objection, her mother was too deep into the bottle to voice much of an opinion one way or other, was that Rodrigo had been a good 10 years older than Millie was, and was a foreigner and a dreamer. Being a dreamer obviously was a sin in Penny's parents' eyes. Doors, in a language Penny couldn't fathom and that didn't seem like Spanish, which Penny had some familiarity with, attempted to convey Millie's painkiller injection schedule to Penny. Zesis, who said Doors was speaking Galician, more like Portuguese than Spanish, interpreted as best he could. Penny managed to get across that she knew all about applying the drugs, as she had just been through that with her father and only needed to know the schedule. When that had been dispensed with, she suddenly found herself alone. All alone, sitting beside a lowly moaning woman who was a mere bag of bones version of the sister she had known so little and so long ago. All alone in a stone cottage, perched on a mountainside who knew where. All alone. Penny had to make frequent trips out to the living room to look at the Christmas tree to keep from sinking into depression. When Millie's breathing became regular, Penny rose from beside the bed and started to wander more purposely around the small house. The light was dim in the main room other than around the Christmas tree. She went to the refrigerator, which was almost bare. What would they do for food? She wondered. Where could she get some? How could she get some? There was a jug in the refrigerator, and she quickly ascertained that it had wine in it. She found a wine glass. There didn't seem to be any dearth of wine glasses in the kitchen. Millie quite likely was her mother's daughter. But Penny wouldn't be catty about that at this moment. She couldn't think of anything more that she wanted, no, needed, at this moment, than wine. She poured herself a glass, pulled a throw blanket off the back of a sofa to wrap around herself, wandered out onto the terrace, and sat in a patio chair there. The moon was full and picked out the checkerboard pattern of fields. What Zesis had said were fincas, cascading like folds in a blanket, down to the ribbon of water below, reflecting the light of the moon. She sighed. The view was divine. The wine was delicious. After a few minutes, though, she shook her head. She wasn't anywhere close to be in the mood to be seduced by this wild and primitive country. She was still in the mood to feel sorry for herself, and at a loss of how she could be expected to carry on here. She rose and walked back into the house, letting her feet carry her to what had been the studio at the front of the house, with its intriguing mysteries. It wasn't just the stacks of paintings, many unfinished, to explore. When Zesis had breezed her through the room before, she'd seen that there was an old secretary desk there with papers strewn across the top. She'd even seen the envelope with her name on it, propped up on the base of the desk lamp. She sat at the desk and fingered the envelope. She returned it to its resting place and took a swig of her wine. She wasn't ready to face whatever that said yet. Her eye went to a couple of folded pages that looked like documents. The thicker of the two seemed to be a will. Ah, good, progress, she thought. Whether there was one, and where it could be found had been a worry in the back of her mind all the time she was flying here. She had no idea what, if anything, Millie had to leave behind, let alone who she'd leave it to. She only knew that she'd be left doing something about it. She had kept forcing those worries into the background, as being ghoulish to be thinking about yet. She folded the official-looking document open now. It was in Spanish and hard to decipher, but she saw Millie's name, with the surname Perez and her own on the first sheet. There were 3 sheets of paper, the other 2 with Millie's name but someone else's, a different name on each sheet. There were lists of bequests, probably of property, under the names on each sheet. The light was too dim to make it all out, but the listings weren't identical. They seemed to be for different property. Just then, the other legal-looking document was disturbed and fell open. This too was in Spanish, but this was more identifiable. It was a marriage certificate. The names on it were Rodrigo Perez Varela and Millicent Stanley de Perez. It was dated some 6 years earlier. So, they were married. But Millie had never thought to notify either their father or Penny. Why would Millie keep this from Penny? Millie had communicated rarely and then only tersely, but Penny had regularly. But then, no, she hadn't. She'd followed Millie's lead more than 8 years ago. She'd stopped writing too because little was coming back, and that was before the marriage. Still, Penny reached back for the will to more closely examine that, but just then the lights went out. Her first thought was what sort of backwater place was this that cut the power at night? That was her second thought too, but then she thought, oh well, she was exhausted anyway and had experienced too much today already. She downed the last of the wine in her glass and felt her way through the connecting bathroom to what would be her bedroom, just barely tolerable in its unrenovated condition. Groping around, she found that there was a candle in a holder on her bed stand, with matches beside it. She took this as further evidence that the power was routinely cut at night in the village. The candle gave her enough light to pull night clothes out of her suitcase, use the primitive bathroom facilities, and climb into bed. She was awakened sometime after dawn by the cries of pain coming from across the house. Damn, she thought, looking at her clock and springing out of bed. She'd missed the injection schedule by an hour. Her first testing with taking care of her sister, and she'd bungled the time by an hour. Millie must be in deep pain. Injecting the morphine and getting under Millie and rocking her body until the cries and sobbing subsided took longer than Penny had imagined it would. Doors had been so good about it the previous night, and Penny was so clumsy. Penny would give anything to have the old village woman here now, and she was sure that Millie thought the same, to the extent that Millie could think anything. Millie was lucid, though. For a brief moment or two between the painkiller deadening the pain took effect and put her into a merciful, painless dreamland. It was just a moment of recognition. Her eyes turned to Penny, and a voice Penny recognized across the years weakly said, "Penny, you've come?" Penny castigated herself later for her response. Automatic, unthinking. "You were married, Millie. You didn't tell us." Millie's eyes went dull. She muttered, "You wouldn't have cared if I did," and she turned her face to the wall and was unconscious. Sitting there on the side of the bed, the frail body of her older sister still in her embrace, Penny began to cry silently. She rocked her sister's inert body back and forth, murmuring over and over again, "I would have cared. I would have cared." Getting control of herself, she worked her way from underneath Millie and arranged her sister as comfortably as she could be in the bed. Standing, she looked down at Millie as she smoothed down the flanks of her nightdress. "Oh, Millie, 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 what has become of our family?" she murmured. Not that there would be a family for her for very much longer. She already felt the loneliness slicing through her. A couple of hours later, Penny groped her way into the main room and over to the kitchen area, set up by an island counter. She stared, with regret, at the collapsed, obviously empty, coffee packet and electric coffee pot, unusable with the power still being off. She barely had time to open the unpowered refrigerator to scout out if there was anything that resembled breakfast for her that hadn't spoiled, when there was a knock at the door. When she opened it, Zesis breezed past her with a cardboard box filled with groceries. She caught up with him in time to retrieve the package of ground coffee from on top. "Zesis forgot to tell you where the nearest market was," he said. "So Zesis got a few things for you. Would it help to know where the grocery store is?" Penny asked. "How would I get there?" She recognized that she sounded a bit petulant. She couldn't help it. Everyone else blamed Morning Grouch on the lack of coffee. She'd do so with the best of them. Was she the only one to realize how marooned and out of her element she was here? "There's the Renault. You can drive when you've found the way." "The Renault?" "Yes, under the terrace. The garage. Do you know how to drive?" "Yes, of course." "The refrigerator isn't working," he said, the door open, the light inside not on. "No, the power hasn't come back on," Penny said. "Come back on? How did it go off?" "You don't lose power at night in the village?" "It's been off since last night." "No, we don't lose power at night. Do you have your power cut at night in England?" No, of course not. We don't either. Here. Zesis will be back soon. He handed her the half-unloaded box and disappeared through the front door. Penny barely had time to unload the rest of the groceries before he was back with a short, grizzled-looking, middle-aged man. The lights had already come back on right before the two men showed up. Bad fuse, Zesis explained. Veeder fixed. This is Veeder. Penny and the Spaniard acknowledged each other, while Zesis continued. Veeder lives 2 houses down. He did the work on this house. He can finish for you, if you want. You have any trouble like power going out, just go get Veeder. Veeder is Zesis' father's cousin. Are you all related in this village? Penny asked, as a joke. Mostly yes, Zesis answered seriously. At that moment there was another knock at the door. When she opened the door, she could have hugged Doors and pulled her inside. As far as Penny knew, Doors had been finished here last night, and Penny was entirely on her own now. It only took the one time having to medicate Millie for Penny to know how ill-prepared she was to take over totally. Millie was a much more difficult patient than Penny's father had been, and so frail that Penny was afraid she'd break each time Penny touched her. Penny didn't hug the woman, though, not only because Doors was still taking on a stern countenance, but also because the old woman was holding a basket in front of her. Behind her was another woman, thinner and taller than Doors, but still elderly. She held a large oblong loaf of bread. Handing Penny the basket, Doors marched past her and straight to the bedroom, where, on cue, Millie was rousing and beginning to moan in pain. The other woman stopped in front of Penny, smiled shyly, perched the loaf of bread on top of the contents of the basket, and then continued on past to the kitchen counter. Maria, Zesis explained to Penny. She'll help tidy up the house. And, after another shy bob, Maria started doing just that, giving the door into Millie's bedroom a wide berth. Now, Zesis will be back this afternoon to show you where your finkas are. Where's something you can work in a garden in? The weather has been strange this year. Whereas you were getting winter in England, winter hasn't appeared here yet this year. We haven't had a frost yet, and the weeds know that. But I'll have my sister to take care of. This is not a sprint, Sonora Stanley. Doors will go soon, but she'll be back after lunch to watch Sonora de Perez for a few hours. You need to have breaks. Doors will come back? Yes, as long as she is needed and you need breaks. We are all family here. We will do this together. Penny stood at the door, almost in tears, as she waved Zesis and Veeder down the narrow street toward where Veeder's house must be located. You are a good worker, Zesis said, as they arrived back at the Fiat parked at the end of a row of grapevine frames, and he brought out a bottle of wine. You work fast and don't complain. When you told me we would be weeding in the vineyard and garden finca, I thought the job would be too big to tackle, Penny said, as she collapsed against the car and gratefully received a glass of wine. My sister must have been in the hospital for some time, and not have been able to tend to the fields for quite some time before that. The whole village took on the work, Zesis answered. Ah, that part about you being one big family. Yes. Tell me, I haven't really seen my sister for a long time. Did she get along well in the village? Your sister was. She was a difficult woman to get along with. Ah, I'm not surprised. But the village is treating her like family anyway? I've seen how good and patient Doors is with her, even though I don't discern any affection for Millie there. Is it her sense of treating everyone in the village as family? Yes, of course, why not? Because she is family. I don't understand. Doors Varela is Rodrigo's mother. She did her duty correctly to your sister as Rodrigo's wife, and she is helping to care for your sister because she is family. She could not hold her head up in the village if she didn't do what she could for family. Doors does it for Rodrigo, though, not for your sister. It is complicated. It was clear that Rodrigo loved your sister and that she loved him. But what, Zesis? But Maria is Doors' best friend in the world, and her cousin. So she has always been reserved with your sister. Maria? The woman who came with Doors this morning to clean? I noticed that she didn't come close to my sister's bedroom. Did she and my sister not get along? At some distance. They were family too, but... Penny laughed. This family business seems quite incestuous. How is Maria family to Millie? Rodrigo's first wife, Antia, was Maria's daughter. But once she had died and Rodrigo married your sister, even though they had been living together for some time already, your sister became family too. There is no choice in who is family and who isn't. He looked like he thought Penny was going to dispute that assertion and that he'd have to repeat it more forcefully. Penny didn't challenge him, though. As Millie's sister, she realized she had to respond to any of this family business gently and with sensitivity. And you? Where do you fit into this family, Zesis? She asked, assuming she had reached the end of this string at last, flabbergasted at how interrelated the villagers were, and that Millie could become, and couldn't escape, being accepted into their family simply by marrying Rodrigo. Maria is my mother. Antia was my sister. The conversation paused there as Penny tried to catch her breath at this revelation. This man, who had been so kind and supportive of her, was the brother of the woman Penny's sister had wronged for so many years. Penny was breathless at the mindset of the strength of family and of the simple goodness of these Galician people. I'm so sorry, Zesis. I didn't realize. You can't have liked my sister very much, and you can't have wanted to help me very much either, as I am her sister. As I said, your sister is a difficult woman, Zesis said, but then he smiled. I don't find you a difficult woman, though, at all, and I would help you even if I did, because I'm family, Penny finished for him, and they both laughed, clinked glasses, and took a long drag on their wine. I must say you people extend the concept of family quite a bit. Let's see. I'm the sister to Rodrigo's second wife, and you are the brother of his first. The relationship of all of us to Rodrigo makes you and me family. If you think about it, all of us on Earth are family, Zesis answered. And wouldn't it be well if we all thought in those terms? There wasn't anything Penny could say to that. She just smiled, comforted by the thought and wishing that it could be so. Later that night, after she had managed to settle Millie down, Penny went back to the secretary in the studio and picked up the will again. This time, under stronger light of the candle in addition to the desk lamp, she looked more closely at the 3 separate bequests that had been made. The first set, this house, the fincas Zesis had taken her to today, the Renault under the terrace, and the surrender value of Millie's annuity from her job as a writer were being left to her. A house in the village, presumably Rodrigo's family home, a few parcels of land, and half of the liquid assets went to Adores Varela, Rodrigo's mother. Dores also was to receive Rodrigo's paintings, with the exception of a small one, a portrait of Millie showing a rare smile and now hanging in Millie's bedroom. This painting was to be buried with Millie along with photographs of Rodrigo. The third bequest, yet another village house, parcels of land, and half of the liquid assets went to Maria Sala, the mother of Rodrigo's first wife and sister of Zesis. Then, and only then, did Penny reach for the envelope with her name on it that she hadn't opened the previous night when the power went out. The letter, as well as the envelope, was addressed to her. She read the short note. I at last am facing the reality of going to the hospital with this cancer, and chances are good I won't be coming out again. There isn't much to say to you now other than I'm sorry we are apart, and I wish you well, Penny. I am leaving you a small house in a village that has become both hell and paradise to me. I hope that the bequest will be enough to draw you here and give you the family that neither of us were provided in England. It was tough going for me here, especially after I lost Rodrigo. I brought it on myself, but Rodrigo was worth every moment of it. I hope you can find the inner joy I have from this slice of paradise and a man as good as my Rodrigo. There is a family here for you if you want one. These people never give up. I'm sure they will be surprised as hell, though, that I'm giving most of Rodrigo back to them. I only hope that I am giving you to them as well, and them to you. If you stay, please try to be a better family member than I was. I wish I at least was a better sister than I was and brought you away with me in the first place. I know you will find this hard to believe, but I would have come to Father's funeral if I could have. It would have been for you, and me though, not for him. Millie's note had touched Penny. Not that it didn't have the same hurt and bitter flair of the woman Penny had known in previous written exchanges with her. Their actual face-to-face time was too buried in the past and in family conflict for Penny to remember it. It was, rather, the recognition in the note that family could have beneficial power, and that, in the end, Millie was giving back to her Galician family and showing them some, albeit begrudged, appreciation. This knowledge made it easier for Penny to care for Millie, who was drifting off but too stubborn to give up yet. Penny found that she could hold Millie more tenderly and competently through the rough periods, which were decreasing in frequency and intensity as Millie's body lost strength, and she floated ever further away from the present world. Millie didn't fight her when Penny cleansed her with a wet washcloth, and there was less whimpering in Millie's unconsciousness. Millie hadn't uttered another word to Penny, though, since that first one about not caring, and there was no recognition given that Penny was even there. In the same circumstances, Penny had resented the bitter, almost judgmental, response from her father as he was dying. But now, with Millie, because of the note and Millie's reverting of her husband's property to his family, other than the property given to Penny with the stated purpose that Penny could, at last, find family herself, Penny could let all of the resentment and hurt feelings evaporate. She was better prepared now, just make her sister's last days as comfortable for her and loving for both of them as possible. Each day Doors and Maria appeared in the afternoon to relieve Penny for a couple of hours. Penny came to see Doors' stiffness as just her way, and Doors was nothing but kind toward both Penny and her sister. With each visit, Penny was picking up another Galician word to use in communication with Doors, and Doors was managing an added English word herself. It wasn't lost on Penny that in all the years Millie was with Rodrigo, Doors must have resisted learning any English to aid communication with Millie, and yet she was making an effort to meet Penny halfway. Maria frequently attended with Doors and puttered around the house, cleaning what hadn't gotten dirty and giving Penny shy but friendly looks, but not going near the room where Millie was drifting away. This also wasn't lost on Penny, that Maria had such strong ties with Doors that she wouldn't let her friend handle this alone, and that she openly accepted Penny even though Penny was the sister to the woman who had snatched the husband of Maria's daughter away from her. Zesis appeared daily, too, always with some new way to pull Penny's mind and body away from caring for her sister, if only for an hour or two. Thus it was that he appeared early Friday evening, with Doors and Maria in tow, and declared that Penny was going with him into the nearest town of any size, Montfort de Lemos, to join in a regular meeting of English-speaking residents of the region for cultural pursuits in that language. Or rather, you'll be taking Zesis, he said. We'll take the Renault. You'll drive. So, this is really to get you used to driving the car here. Although it will be good for you to meet with others who wish to exercise their English. Is that why your English is so good? Penny asked, with a chuckle. Because you meet with this group? But of course. You do not think Zesis English is excellent? Yes, it certainly is, Penny responded. Especially the quaint way of substituting your name for I much of the time, she thought. The English speakers, not many more than a dozen of them beyond Penny and Zesis, met inside a cafe in Montfort de Lemos, while, thanks to the unseasonably warm spell, the outdoor tables were still active and a guitarist was entertaining out there. The cafe was decorated for Christmas both inside and outside, and a portable heater warmed those outside. Galicians were fighting the march into the coldness of winter for as long as they could. Penny found the muffled sound of the Spanish guitar to be a mellowing influence on the buzz of English being spoken in the room, and she couldn't remain untouched by the decorations of the season. Those present constituted an almost equal proportion of Galicians, honing their language skills, and foreigners who already spoke English. She was especially smitten with a handsome man with a wavy mane of salt and pepper-hued hair, who appeared to be in his mid-40s and who stood tall and straight and confident, commanding the room as he positioned himself by the fire and a Christmas tree. People were being drawn to him to bask in his smile and easy laughter, as he naturally became the focus of attention without consciously monopolizing attention. Would you like to meet him? Zesis said, leaning over to whisper in Penny's ear. Who? Oh, the man over there with the books under his arm? Yes, that's Paolo, the one giving the readings this evening. Before Penny could say whether or not she wanted to meet him, Zesis had dragged her over to Paolo and was introducing her. The man turned a winning and interested smile on Penny, and she, like everyone else in the room had done, melted to him. So, you have come to hear love poetry? He asked. His voice was a rich baritone. He went on before she could answer. I'm glad Cousin Zesis has brought new, and oh so lovely, blood into the group. We are usually quite sparse on poetry evening. Poetry? Penny asked, blushing because he had taken one of her hands in his, and she could feel a tingling sensation running up her arm. Yes, he said, taking the books from under his arm and holding them up. First our own Galician romance poet, Roselita de Castro, from her Cantares Gallegos. And then because Roselita can be so melancholy, and because this is an English-speaking group, from Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnets from the Portuguese. So much more hopeful, don't you think? I'll read them both in Galician and English versions. I love the sound of the Galician language, but I don't want the English speakers to miss the power of the words. Roselita was the first one who wrote in our regional language, you know, and she was heavily criticized in Madrid for doing so. But now she's recognized as a national treasure. I hope you will love the sound of the poetry in Galician as well. Yes, of course, Penny murmured, having no idea who De Castro was, but not wanting to disagree with anything this fabulous man beside her said. Then she laughed, and, eyes twinkling, Paolo laughed too, before a woman put a hand on his shoulder, saying she wanted to show him something about the lectern from which he'd be reading. Penny hadn't laughed about poetry, though, but because it had just hit her that Zesis had said he was a cousin. Yet more family. Who is that fascinating man? Penny asked Zesis as Paolo moved away from them. You said he was a cousin. That's Paolo Perez Varela, Rodrigo's younger brother. He teaches English literature at the University of Santiago de Compostela. Rodrigo's brother? Penny asked. And is he as good as Rodrigo was? Zesis laughed. They were both very good men, Penny, but in different ways. Rodrigo was the better painter and Paulo the better poet. But, as men, both good, very good, yes. Very good family. Zesis, of course, didn't realize what Penny was really referring to, and only now, causing her to laugh a happy, tinkling laugh again, did Penny herself realize why she'd asked that question. She remembered now the sentence in Millie's letter, hoping that Penny could find as good a man here as Rodrigo had been. Is he married? She blurted out. Zesis laughed again. Only to his poetry at this point. But he is a widower and it's high time he found another worthy wife. Penny turned to look into Zesis' face to see that he was giving her a sharp look. Amusement with something else in it, as well. Hope perhaps? Perhaps this outing to meet with other English speakers wasn't as random a choice of Zesis as she'd assumed. She blushed and decided she needed to change the subject. Not that she really was changing the subject. You said that Vitor is the one who renovated the modern part of Millie's house. Do you think he'd be interested in renovating the other part too? I'm sure he would. Are you thinking of getting a better price for it fully renovated? I'm thinking of living there myself, Penny said, the answer surprising her as much as it obviously pleased Zesis. Good, he said, and just then a waiter came up to them to get their drink orders. The waiter didn't seem to understand Penny's question of whether they had a favorite brand of local white wine. Zesis interjected with a, I don't think he understands English. I'll ask him. Zesis speaks Galician. Jesus certainly does speak Galician, Penny thought, truly happy and content for the first time in years. She only now realized how long her elusive search for a family had been, and that she had found one for herself in Galicia, if she didn't screw this up. Or, rather, perhaps, Millie had given her a family as a last, parting gift, with an assist now from Zesis. She wasn't alone. If any people on earth understood what it meant to be Jesus' people, she thought, it had to be the Galicians. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.